what I'm going to be talking about is really, like she said, the clinical side and the general population perspective of PTSD. But so many things that you said rang true. I've made some notes in my talk today already, just from things that you said. It was a great testimony, and I'd like to talk to you again soon. I know I'm partners with Rick in the clinics, and we also have a foundation, a nonprofit that teaches professionals and also provides services to underserved populations, to veterans, first responders, police. In fact, we're doing a veterans group this next weekend for 50 to 75 vets, teaching them about the function of their brain, but I'll tell you guys more about that later. Today, I really want to challenge everybody's thinking. Now, you guys are boots on the ground, and so you're seeing the rise in PTSD symptoms across the board, and especially the spring that we've had traumatic event over traumatic event up until, this morning's news, traumatic events that are causing these PTSD symptoms to show up. But if you try to diagnose them as PTSD in the DSM, it doesn't add up, does it? Because, speaking from my own personal experience, I was a victim of emotional and verbal abuse. That's not in the DSM under PTSD, does not count. Natural disaster is, my house was destroyed twice by flood, twice in 2 years. And so I had to deal with PTSD over cloudy skies. But I do want to challenge everybody's thinking today as how we look at the PTSD client. I really welcome your input. We need to be discussing this right now. And one thing that Glenn said was that nobody wants a diagnosis. They just want help. And I think that's a really important thing to talk about. Whether or not the person has a diagnosis, they meet all of the criteria for PTSD. Really what we're looking at is a post-traumatic stress response. And I'm not the only one saying this. Lots of clinicians are coming out and saying this is their response to stress. And it's an anxiety response. It's a panic disorder response. It's a acute stress response. It's how the brain is expressing what's going on, that there's a problem. And as we go through the information today, I just want you to keep in mind that when we treat mental disorders, it's really like a recipe book. What ingredients are we throwing in to make a cake? Well, for example, if we have symptoms A, B, C, and D, it's PTSD. If we have just A, B, C, then it's acute stress disorder. If we have just B and C, then it's panic disorder. All of the symptoms really are coming from one problem, and that is an inability to manage our thoughts and emotions based on a couple of factors that I'll talk about. So what if we did treat the actual problem? If we figured out that this was a developmental skill that we're missing for whatever reason, could we prevent mental illness? I believe we can. So we're going into schools and we're teaching these foundations to children as young as 4 years old, the same things that we're teaching to the veterans next weekend. And the response on both ends has been really amazing progress and change in their thoughts and their behaviors. I'm going to have to use my glasses, sorry. Here we go. So PTSD symptoms, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. There we go. There we go. So PTSD symptoms, am I able to do that? There we go. Really is widespread. We are seeing schools use blanket use of trauma-informed therapy. Why are they doing that? Well, because it's working. They're seeing people in schools, kids in schools expressing their trauma that they do have from home, and what Glenn said about complex trauma, I think is a great thing. I think that our society is experiencing complex trauma like never before, whether it's because of the media or whether it's because of, unstable families, whatever it is. trauma is prevalent in our society. And again, I believe it does not have to be real. It can also be perceived trauma. Someone that looks like me is experiencing trauma, and so I need to be worried about it. So we're treating clients with trauma-informed therapy before we even know what's going on. And again, that's working. We have huge numbers of people suffering symptoms without fitting the DSM guidelines. It's occurring, and my belief is that it is just a lack of that developmental skill to be able to process what's happening to them or around them. So regardless of symptoms, as I said, the core issue is just that lack of developmental skills. Now, everything doesn't traumatize us. If we have a negative experience, it doesn't always create trauma. For example, the first time you burn your hand on the stove, does that mean you avoid the kitchen the rest of your life? No, it didn't traumatize you because you processed it, you learned something from it, and whether you thought of it positively or negatively, you still go into the kitchen and you cook on the stove. That's what is supposed to happen. But when certain emotions are attached to an event, and like Glenn said, with a moral injury, I think that's a huge thing. There's an emotion attached to that event. The trauma event can trigger mental illness. And so this takes learned skills to overcome. All right, so what are the risk factors of PTSD? When I did some research this week, I found a very shocking list. I don't see military on there as a risk factor. It's very interesting, isn't it, Glenn? I see you shaking your head. Being female is a risk factor. Being a minority is a risk factor. Lower socioeconomic status, less education, separation from parents, trauma before age 6. And that goes back to what you said too, Glenn. Having that trauma often makes the person go into the military and prepares their mind to trigger those PTSD symptoms later on when something happens that they can't rationalize. So tell me, you guys, what comes to mind when you look at this list? What do you think of when you look at this list? To me, I see people who have been oppressed or disenfranchised. They have a lack of opportunity, a lack of control due to their status or their situation. If that's true, then the complex trauma theory applies. Don't you think? That the brain is being prepared to have PTSD. So going forward, what are other negative factors in those suffering from PTSD? Poor coping skills, negative appraisal or pessimism about the situation, having already had a trauma and being diagnosed with acute stress disorder, getting repeated upsetting reminders, i.e. media, that beautiful little news bar that's on the bottom of the television screen anytime anything bad is happening. You cannot look up, can't look on your phone without getting those upsetting reminders. Subsequent negative life events, either real, perceived, or associated with someone like you. And like Glenn said, poor social support. But we do have protective factors, which are the good social support, usually prior to the event, and not being female, low socioeconomic status, minority, etc. So really briefly, I want to look at the DSM and what the requirements actually are. And I don't like PTSD, I like PTSR, post-traumatic stress response. And saying that, I feel gives my clients a lot of hope. It shows my confidence that they are able to change the wiring in their brain. We know that that's true. We know the brain is plastic. We know it can change. We know you can make new neuronal pathways to improve your mental health, change the chemistry in your brain. And so showing that confidence, I think, has been key with the people that we've been able to help. So, oh, here we go. Sorry. So what is the main requirement for PTSD? It is that you've had to experience death or serious injury or the threat of the same personally, either in yourself or in a close family member, a close friend. But media coverage does not count. It says explicitly it is inadequate. You cannot diagnose someone with PTSD just over media coverage. I'm curious how many of you agree with that. War, kidnapping, sexual assault, physical abuse, natural disaster, genocide, car accidents, those all are acceptable reasons to diagnose with PTSD if they also meet all of these other symptoms. Intrusive reactions, which is your dreams, flashbacks, disassociation, irrational triggering, avoidance of memories or situations with any similarity to the event. And of course, they're talking about the event which triggered the PTSD. Alterations in cognition, which is amnesia, forgetting some of the event, not being able to remember it, remembering it wrong or incorrectly, exaggerated negative beliefs. I'm never going to be able to do that. I always, right? Distorted beliefs about the cause of the event, especially blaming themselves, detachment, an ability to feel happy. Then we have alterations in arousal or reactivity. That's your being jumpy, outbursts, reckless behavior, hypervigilance, poor sleep and poor focus, significant impairment of function. In, of course, this is standard for all DSM diagnoses. It has to impair your areas of function, social, work, and relationships, not due to substance use or other physical condition. And it begins after a trauma and persists more than a month. So to me, the DSM is not recognizing complex trauma as related to PTSD. However, we know that that's not true. So do all of these symptoms fit your PTSD clients? Do you have PTSD clients that don't fit all these symptoms? That you're confident that's PTSD, but they didn't have a car accident. They haven't been to war. And of course, my answer is no. So what are some things that there we go again with my little thing. So what are we missing? I actually read a journal article that neglect is a common cause of PTSD. Well, that's not in the DSM, but I believe that's true. Discrimination, systemic discrimination, profiling, emotional abuse, verbal abuse. I think all of you would agree with many, if not all of these, and you probably have more to add to the list. But what did these things have in common? All of these conditions have in common these four things: a feeling of powerlessness, a feeling of uncertainty about the future, disappointment. Their expectations are not met either in themselves. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have been there. That shouldn't have, he shouldn't have done that to me. And fear, inability to protect himself or others. And my point of bringing all this together is to show that, in my view, and others that I work with, that PTSD and other mental illnesses are not about the event. They're about the emotion attached to the event. So is the PTSD brain broken? It's not broken. Now, some people have traumatic brain injury like Glenn, and that's to be determined still if that had an effect or it just triggered. It was another compounding effect of the complex trauma, which I think you mentioned, Glenn. Bruce Ecker is a clinician out in California. He has a foundation. He came up with memory reconsolidation. It's an activity that goes across theories. It's independent of theories, and you can use it many different ways. What he does is he finds the triggering event or some event that's traumatic. He has the client experience it while in the office in a safe place. He wants them to really feel it, even somatically. I want to know what's happening in your body. And then he introduces something completely incompatible with that event that the client has experienced as well. For example, eating their favorite ice cream that doesn't elicit negative emotions. He does that over and over until the brain finally learns, oh, I don't understand why we're tasting ice cream and we're feeling the emotion of this event at the same time. I need to really figure this out. It goes around, it detaches from the negative emotion, and the brain fixes in the neocortex to try to figure it out. Suddenly, you've experienced that memory without the negative emotion. And if you do it 2 or 3 times, you learn in this exercise that that's a possibility. You create a new neuronal pathway, and suddenly you don't have the trauma from that event anymore. Moving forward, you might try it again with another event until your brain learns that pattern. And this is the developmental skill that I was talking about. So all of us have already done this. We've all created a new neuronal pathway to detach a negative feeling from an event. Whether it's you learned to swim. The first time you went to swim, you probably were in fear of your life. You screamed, you cried, someone maybe threw you in. You still thought you were going to die, and you were terrified afterwards. After a while, you go more slowly, you take more care, you learn how to swim, and after a while, you don't have that negative feeling, that terror anymore. You've detached the negative emotion, and you have moved it to the neocortex, which is where your logic comes from. Changing the emotion about it doesn't change the event, and that's really important. People need to know that they did experience terrible things. I think that's important. We try to validate our clients' experiences. We also validate their emotions. That doesn't mean that the emotion has to stay. When you change the emotion, you change your reaction, you change your behavior, and move on with your life. It still is there, and it's still a memory, but it doesn't have to cause those PTSD symptoms. In fact, research has been coming out in the last 10 years that's validated we do have control over our limbic system, which is what causes those alerts and those reactions, and that it's related to new neuronal pathways created through habitual inaction or action. And there's many programs, many different therapies, and these 3 are the accepted treatments that are approved of by the military for use with PTSD, which is exposure therapy, trauma cognitive behavioral therapy, and EMDR. Those are the only 3 that are approved. What do these 3 do? They do the same thing. They have you change neuronal pathways to go from the limbic system to the neocortex rather than the limbic system to the brainstem. They do it either actively with EMDR, where the clinician sends pulses, or now they're using lights, they're using tones, they're using little buzzers in your hand to make that happen, or they do it passively by having the veteran re-experience the event in a safe environment over and over and over and over again until the brain figures out, oh, I'm not in danger. I'm going to make a new neuronal pathway so I don't trigger my brainstem. Regardless, all of these are towards reaching the same goal of reprogramming the brain. Something that we learned to do as a child, but because of that complex trauma, we stopped doing, many of us, and we don't apply it to today. So what's the physiology of this? What's happening in the PTSD brain? Well, the way the brain is supposed to work, well, the way the brain does work is that we have 3 main parts for this purposes of this discussion. We have the limbic system, whose function is to protect you by scanning and alerting you to personal danger, perceived danger, like a smoke alarm. It could be burnt toast, or it could be the house on fire, but it sends a signal, and it's the same signal every time. And the signal will go through the neuronal pathway to either the brainstem or the neocortex. The brainstem, which is called here the reptilian brain, it functions to provide you the physical ability to respond to alerts. It gives you those chemicals in your body to either fight, flight, or freeze. Those are the only three things it knows. And actually, it's not even what it knows. It's just three things that it does. It's a mechanism. It doesn't know you. The other possibility is that the limbic system signals to the neocortex. The neocortex is where we need to be. If it gets routed there, the signal is analyzed, a decision is made on whether to call the fire department or take the toast out of the toaster, right? It uses logic. That's where your skills are, your experience, your motivations, your the importance of things in your life, things you care about, all the positive things that we want to use to make decisions to act and not react are in the neocortex. And we have to teach people how to get there. We've been teaching them for too long that feelings are the only thing that matter, that they're not the only thing. They do matter, but so does managing your brain. And I think that is the next step in mental health. So what is the PTSD brain doing? What do y'all think from just looking at this diagram? It's scanning, it's scanning, it's scanning. Let's talk about you, Glenn. You go to the grocery store and someone gets too close and your limbic system alerts you and it sends it straight to the brainstem and you react. Would you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it floods you with the chemistry. I forget the chemicals, but just floods
adrenaline.
You with
Absolutely. Absolutely. It floods your body with adrenaline, and what are you going to do? But you're going to snap. And that's any of us. If I have PTSD, I was at a conference one time and I was sitting there waiting at the conference before speaking at a class, I think. And someone got up and was talking about the flood and their experience with the flood. I got through, I think about, 10 minutes. And my limbic system decided, this is really bad. This is going to happen to you again. I think hurricane season was coming up again. I don't know. I had to get out of there. That was it. And I had so much of that adrenaline in my body. I walked around and around and around and around to try to get that energy out. But I was living in my limbic. And so that loop of limbic to brainstem is something that we have to break by creating new neuronal pathways. And the neuronal pathways are highways or they're alleys, depending on how often you use them. And those of us that live in the country, I use the cow path analogy, right? If you have a rock in the field and the cows have to get from here at the gate to the hay bale, they go around the rock. And if they go around the rock enough times, it creates a path. If you move the rock, what do? Do they go straight? No, they follow the path. That's what our brain does too. You have to lead that cow in a straight line with a halter until that new path is created and the old one has grass growing on it. And so the same way, the more we redirect our thoughts to the neocortex, the wider that pathway will become. And then when we're caught off guard, the brain will fall into that wide pathway. I've seen it again and again with my clients. It works. And the research done by Bruce Ecker, which they do it a little differently, they've had multiple labs verify that this is the case. And there are even skills out there which include mindfulness, positivity, things like that, that will train your brain to have those neuronal pathways without going through crisis, which is a very interesting thing to discuss. I would love to talk about that sometime. So we had a veteran just go through a session teaching this information, one of our workshops. We do workshops. We keep it very simple, easy to understand, and we didn't talk to the vets afterwards We usually follow up after a couple of weeks, but the wife calls the counselor who set the workshop up, and she said, I don't know what happened at that workshop, but my husband's a different man. She said, what do you mean? She said, he's calm. He doesn't get pace all the time. He doesn't hide in his room. He's laughing. He's walking outside. He went and met his friends down the street. What did you do? Well, all we did was teach him this. We taught him what the brain is supposed to do, and we gave him control. And he got it. So what does the PTSD patient need? They really do need empowerment. Nobody wants to be a victim. The items here that I've listed are basically the opposite of that common thread slide that we talked about earlier, which are disappointment, fear, powerlessness, uncertainty. They need to know with confidence that their brain is not broken and that they can heal. They need to understand themselves, accept their true self as wonderful. Excuse me. And often that comes from being validated with the counselor. And be taught that they can control their thoughts. And not only can they, but they're supposed to. And, using the examples similar to what I've told you guys today, the fact that they've already done it. They did it when they learned to ride a bike. They do it every time we learn a lesson from a negative experience. We do it. Now, at our organization, when we're in schools or with the first responders, what we do is we teach clients to do this on their own. Like teach a man to fish, right? Isn't it better if we teach someone how to do this for themselves? We teach them how to do it through simplified psychoeducation about the brain. We use it with clients age 4 and up. We use cute characters. We have them name their limbic brain so that they have complete control. I've named it. It gives you power over it. It's not a person in your brain. It's just like a smoke detector. It just is an alarm system. We teach them methods to create those new healthy neuronal pathways to process alerts properly. We help them with healing their core emotional wound, which goes back to what you said, Glenn, that started a long time ago, right? We have found that without fail, every single client that has a traumatic event, we find out the emotion attached, and it's the same emotion with their very first negative memory when they were an innocent child, before age 7, before the neocortex was developed. If it's abandonment, they felt abandonment back then. If it's unloved back then. Whatever it is, it's the same thing. It's almost like we program our brain to expect to hear that negative message. It's very interesting. We help them to change the emotion of their event. We give them control over their thoughts through different little skills that we teach them. And we help them to practice their methods. And we found that they have rapid change and even immediate change walking out the door, just from the psychoeducation portion of it. And then following through with the rest of these items, teaching them and practicing the skills, they continue to improve. We've tracked their progress after we stop therapy, which therapy is 3 to 6 sessions. That's it. We do follow up once in a while. They of course can come in for talk therapy if they want to, but a lot of them it's 3 to 6 sessions. We follow up with them later, and they have continued improvement after the stopping of the therapy, and that's because they've learned to do it themselves. They start to apply it to other situations. We had a man up in Spring who suffered from PTSD and was relegated to his bedroom. He wouldn't leave the house. He didn't want to. He had the drapes shut. He didn't want to see light. Those glints of light sometimes remind them of flashes of bombs, and wouldn't spend time with his family. Again, 1 session, and he came back the next week and said, I don't know what you did. And of course, we said, we didn't do it, you did it. but I can come out of my room now. I can spend time with my family. I think I might go to my friend's house because I can trust myself not to be triggered, not to have those reactions. We said, great. So after another session, he came back the week later and said, I think I'm going to go to a baseball game. I think I might be able to get a job. So within about 3 months after doing the therapy, teaching him about himself, and really it is that simple. Don't think it's not that simple, because it is. Teaching them how their brain is supposed to work and giving them the skills to do it, he was able to take a plane trip. He would never have thought of doing that, he said. He said, my biggest problem now is how to spend all my time, because I used to spend all my time worrying and being afraid of what would happen to me if I went out around other people. And just to show you that this also works across other mental disorders, we had a 6-year-old who was diagnosed with severe oppositional defiant disorder. We did a session. This child had been in the classroom very rarely because he was throwing tables, throwing objects, a danger to himself and others. Not in the class. He would have at least 1 outburst a day. If not, they said 3 a day normally, and have to leave the classroom. We had a session with him, and his mother called the next week and said, again, what did you do to him? We didn't do anything to him. We gave him control over his thoughts. We had him name his limbic system. He named it John Cena. It was very exciting for him. And he said the next time he came in, we said, how was school? How you been doing? And he said, John Cena really wanted me to get mad, but I didn't want to get in trouble, so I told him to go sit in the corner. He got it. He understood that he's responsible for changing these, and that he's able to. It's possible to do in a real way. So we had a few sessions with the child. After 6 months, he only had 1 outburst. And he actually had come in afterward and said, John Cena got the best of me, but he won't do it again. So it was a really beautiful thing. It is very simple. It is foundational. And just to kind of wrap everything up, I know I've taken a long time. I want to emphasize that PTSD is curable, but it isn't curable, in my view, my experience, from the outside. It has to be the person doing the work. But when you express to them that this is their response, that their brain isn't broken, then that motivation comes out to do the work because they see hope. Risk factors obviously increases the likelihood of experiencing symptoms, and trauma happens to us all. And I believe complex trauma is a serious condition of the society right now.